Hello and welcome back to Once Upon a Screen Time. This is part 2 of The Thief, His Wife and the Canoe. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, make sure you do so. The link will be in the description. So let's go. Once upon a time, in a fairy tale land called Panama, a man named John Darwin thought he'd pulled off the ultimate heist, fake his death, collect some insurance, and live happily ever after. But as we all know, in fairy tales there is no such thing as a foolproof plan. And the only thing waiting at the end of John's wild scheme is a whole lot of disappointment. Welcome to the final part of The Thief, His Wife and the Canoe, where John's brilliant escape plan comes crashing down faster than a sinking canoe. In this installment, we follow the twisted journey of John and his long-suffering wife Anne as they try to adjust to life on the run. But fate and their own terrible decision-making have other plans. This is a tale full of fraud, bad disguises, an accidental reunion with an old photo, and some truly spectacularly poor planning. Prepare for a retelling where happily ever after is nowhere in sight, and Prince Charming of our story is a man with no regard for logic or consequences. Our story picks up in Panama when John and Anne Darwin are settling into their new life after successfully faking John's death. They've escaped England and all the people they deceived. Or at least that's what John thinks. In his mind, Panama is the new fairy tale kingdom, a place where they can spend their insurance payout, sip drinks by the beach, and live happily ever after. John envisions himself as a hero, the mastermind who beat the system and won. Unfortunately for him, reality is waiting to smack him over the head with a big fat plot twist. Right from the start, it's clear that the Panama lifestyle isn't as easy as John imagined. There are residency rules to follow, taxes to pay, and all kinds of official paperwork that requires, a real identity. John, having left his identity back in England, is finding it surprisingly tricky to establish a legitimate life with a fake name. Anne is also in a constant state of panic, wrestling with guilt and anxiety as they try to blend in. But John's not bothered. In his mind, he's practically royalty, living the high life in Panama. For Anne, though, this paradise is starting to look more like prison. As they attempt to secure permanent residency, John and Anne run into their first major roadblock. They need proper identification to buy property. This legal requirement hits John like a ton of bricks, as if he never expected that living in another country would require proof that he exists. Who knew? Rather than considering an alternate plan, John decides to double down on the deception, forging documents and doing whatever it takes to secure their dream home. Here's something to consider, dear John. If your new life requires a fake identity and fake documents, it's probably not going to be paradise. Anyway, Anne is reaching her breaking point, balancing the guilt of deceiving their sons with the constant fear of getting caught. Her conscience is screaming louder than ever, but she can't shake free from John's bizarre charisma, or more likely, his constant badgering. So she goes along with it, all while secretly hoping that this new house will miraculously solve all their problems. Spoiler alert, it won't. So, dear Anne, if your husband's grand plan involves constant forgery, just maybe reconsider your choice in partners. As John and Anne continue their life in Panama, fate decides it's time for a little reality check. You see, while the Darwins are trying to live under the radar, a photo from Panama resurfaces in England, featuring a very alive John Darwin. Yes, folks, our master of disguise was spotted out and about, blissfully unaware that his presence was documented in full color. The photo is the spark that lights the bonfire of their downfall. It is soon circulating back home, and people are starting to ask questions. Meanwhile, John is oblivious, still convinced he's a criminal genius who can't be caught. The reality of their situation begins to dawn on Anne, who's now trapped in a nightmare of John's making, realizing that every move they make brings them closer to exposure. Here's something to note. If you're going to fake your own death, maybe avoid appearing in pictures from halfway across the world. As the walls close in, Anne can't handle the stress any longer. The guilt and shame are eating her alive, and finally, she makes the decision to return to England. As if this whole thing didn't get more surreal, John decides to resurrect himself and go back to England as well. He concocts a story about having amnesia, claiming he didn't know who he was for all these years. In John's mind, the story is foolproof, the perfect explanation for his disappearance and sudden return. In reality, it's a desperate, pathetic last-ditch attempt to salvage his scheme. The British public, however, isn't buying it. His return is greeted with media frenzy and public outrage as people realize that John Darwin, the missing man, was alive, living it up in Panama while his family grieved. The news hits like a tidal wave, and the public watches in shock and awe as John's elaborate house of lies finally collapses. John, if your plan involves a story of amnesia that only happens in soap operas, don't expect that people will believe you. With his fake amnesia story falling apart, John finds himself in court, facing fraud charges. This is where we get to see John's true colors as he attempts to convince the court that he's a misunderstood man who lost his memory. The courtroom is filled with skeptical stares and sighs, as everyone from the judge to the general public realizes that John is as deluded as he is dishonest. Anne, now fully aware of the gravity of their crimes, admits her guilt, hoping for a sliver of redemption. She's finally free of John's influence, but it's too late to undo the damage. The court sentences both John and Anne to prison, and the fairy tale ends with them behind bars. The ultimate ironic twist for a man who once worked as a prison officer. With John and Anne serving time, the fallout from their scheme ripples through their family and the public. Their sons, betrayed and humiliated, have to pick up the pieces of their lives after learning that their father not only faked his own death, but also put them through years of heartache and loss. The family is left shattered, and John's legacy is forever tainted by his selfish choices. In the end, John's quest for an easy escape from debt only led to heartbreak, public disgrace, and prison time. Instead of the tropical paradise he dreamed of, he's left with a cell and a tarnished reputation. As for Anne, she's left to grapple with her own guilt, knowing that she enabled his deception and betrayed her own family. Moral of the story: if you're looking for a fairy tale ending, maybe avoid lies, deception, forgery, things like that. And we reach the end of our twisted fairy tale. The Thief, His Wife, and the Canoe is not a story of heroism or redemption. It's a story of greed, dishonesty, and the cost of running from one's responsibilities. John Darwin's quest for a fresh start only led him to ruin, while Anne's loyalty blinded her to the consequences until it was far too late. In the end, there are no magical solutions or happy endings, just the harsh reality of poor choices and shattered lives. So remember, if you're ever finding yourself dreaming of a tropical escape, maybe leave the canoe at home and choose a path that doesn't end in prison. Bye!